display. My name is Sonam Dukta. Um, I, s- I studied linguistics and language pedagogy at SOAS. I did a master's a few years back. I can't remember now. And I also did a bit of Tibetan language teaching at SOAS. Today I'm going to interview Professor Robbie Barnett. Uh, he's well-known Tibetan, modern Tibetan historian and expert on current affairs. He started Tibet Information Network TIN in 1988, and also he worked at Columbia University in New York, and now he's associate professor at SOAS and also researcher at King's College London. Welcome and thank you so much for doing the interview with Londonney. And first of all, I'd like to start like your background. If you can tell us about yourself before you started TIN.
Okay, well, to education, education, okay, easier for me. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be invited to do this interview with you. And of course, I've known you for a long, long time, over many years. And actually, I should thank you for all the help you gave to the late Jamche Kapchupa in recent years. So thank you very much, Dugda. So yeah, my name is Robbie Barnett. I'm from London, so I was born and brought up here. And my background's a little unorthodox for an academic. I'm not really trained as an academic. I had to learn as I went along, because the first, my first experience of Tibetans was when I left school. I worked in India for a year with a very famous English woman who was Anila with the Karmapa, 16th Karmapa, a woman called Frida Bedi, who was quite close to Indira Gandhi and helped in 1959 when the refugees came. So I got to know her after I left school when I was 17, and I taught in a little gompa in northern India, in Dalhousie.
And I'm kind of like also kind of surprised that, like the people in the government aren't interested in somebody of Chamjala's caliber defecting kind of from inside Tibet, which has never happened before.
Yeah,
That's kind of like...
I was surprised too. You think, of course, later on they're very excited, but no, they're not. You know, governments don't really work from knowledge.
Sure.
They have certain people who in the research department at Foreign Office who are very interested in knowledge, but they're quite minor figures. Their ministers don't always listen to them. That's why we end up with this disastrous 2008 decision of Britain recognizing Tibet as part of China. They're not listening to their own research people, historians and so on. So it's a disappointing thing, government, really. It's a big machine and it's not always a very smart machine. But Jamche, that moment of the Tibet office, Mr. Tuckler asking me to help Jamche was a historic point, because later on, a year later, when it was safer, Jamche decided to come and work with us in TIN. And it was, as you know, such an incredible advantage for us to have this extraordinary person to interpret the documents we were seeing, the things we were hearing, and always able to give us an understanding that I had never imagined, that would be well beyond anything we had thought of or could have thought of.
I think it's still I think it's same in many sense, that people still don't understand the two kind of like sides of China's information. You have to read so much between the lines. You know, they're trying to project something which sometimes is for their public benefit, sometimes it's for the Westerners' benefit, and people don't seem to know like that.
What do you remember learning from him? What struck you most?
I mean, for me, like staying with him as a friend, I think he kind of like made me appreciate more the Tibetan culture and things. He was always trying to teach me things like Sakja Lekshe that his father had taught him, sort of thing, and always trying to teach me a bit of Shesa and stuff, which I was really bad at. But yeah, so I think, and I was also always trying to learn a bit more about what's happening in Tibet and also in China, because he has so much knowledge. And I think like coming to like the modern kind of like just before, I mean, he passed away with the pandemic and stuff. So I mean, he was a bit more kind of like say optimistic about Xi Jinping, that he's trying to consolidate power and that things might get worse, but then it will be improved. And I think even Tibetans were kind of optimistic about Xi Jinping. So what do you think is happening now? You know, it's like still optimistic? Is there?
I think you're completely right that Jamche thought, or maybe had been told, that things were going to get better, that there might be a solution between His Holiness and China. I don't remember he ever say that, but I think you're right. He thought things were going in that direction. And I think, as your question implies, they haven't really gone in that direction.
Yeah. Recently reading the news that, you know, he's purged so many generals, so many of his kind of, I guess, rivals, in the sense that maybe he's still trying to consolidate power before the next kind of, I guess, the election or whatever, that he still hasn't fully got everything under control, sort of thing.
Yeah, I suppose if you're a good communist or a good Marxist, you always assume there's struggle.
Yeah.
You have a theory which says, not just experience, but a theory which says conflict is the essence of progress or of human history. There's always going to be competition, there's always going to be challenges, things are changing, you have to adapt your policy and so on. And that might manifest as opposition or something like that, but it can also manifest as economic structures of change that mean your economy might collapse, that could undermine you, but also what they focus on much more, they're always trying to focus us, the readers of what the Chinese say, on international opposition. So they're very focused on the idea that there's an imperialist kind of set of powers, America, Britain, etc., and their world, the communist world, should we call it more, maybe Chinese world, I don't know if it's still communist. So they're very, very attentive to this sense of ongoing struggle. They're not Trotskyists, but they're borrowing from a Trotskyist vocabulary of, of eternal revolution. You constantly have to do this. And this is probably a driving force behind this whole philosophy of I've got to have a new policy tomorrow morning to deal with this potential threat. So everything in a way is arranged around a kind of sense of a new threat emerging, economic, international, or ethnic. There's a very strong sense of what they now call the ethnic, what we would call maybe nationalities. They see that as a threat.
I mean, technically, I'm like see that in their own constitution it used to be nationalities, but they later on they sort of like more once the more Chinese students came abroad, they tried to change it too.
I have a story about that. I vaguely remember meeting Mel Goldstein, who is an extraordinary person. I mean, what he's done, the amount of work he's done, dictionaries, grammars, history is incredible. But I think I remember meeting him in London. He was on his way to China, to Beijing. I think it was 1990 or 91 or something. Yeah. He wasn't very friendly to me. He didn't trust me at all. Sure. Who was I? I was nobody running this tin thing. It's not academic. What did he say? But I remember him saying that the Chinese have got it all wrong about Tibet. He didn't mean they didn't understand. He meant their policy was wrong. So he had ideas about policy. He said they should learn from us, America, how to deal with these ethnic problems. Look at our problem with race and black people in America. It takes 200 years to change. They should understand it as an ethnic problem. And he went to Beijing basically the following week, and I think he told them. Okay. I think he may have talked to people saying, you want to stop thinking about this as an independent nation trying to get independence. You want to think about it as an ethnicity issue, a cultural issue that takes a long time. And that's what happened. There must have been other people saying this as well as him. And that's what happened. They started to, by 95, they put out a regulation, which we've never seen. But as you say, we could see the results saying, no, nobody in China, in English text, should use the word nationality. They should always say ethnicities. So by then, by 95, they'd got this message from their people or whatever, similar to what Mel had said to me, that they should ethnicize. From their point of view, that's culturalizing. It's a cultural problem. It's not that these people have a political future as an independent. It's that there's a cultural problem.
Because I was always kind of like confused and thinking, why are they learning from the worst habits of colonists and trying to, eradicate certain people from their kind of like the colonized land, trying to get rid of their culture, their language, and this. And I'm thinking like, if they learn from the kind of like the negative impact of these in all the other places, then they should, if they're saying the imperialism and this is bad, while they're learning the worst habits, now I think I realize is they're learning from the wrong people, maybe, who are trying to introduce this as the right way.
Goldstein would have been quite a good person for them to learn from, because he would have said, keep the language, keep the people. He would never have imagined that they would go doing what they're doing now. But you're right. I was thinking a more simpler way, actually, same idea. When they go abroad, and they send people abroad all the time, or they started to do that from the 80s to get ideas from other countries. Why do they send them to Britain and America? We're the worst two countries in the world for multilingual, multicultural understanding. We are, nobody in England, basically, no ordinary English person learns another language, They should be in Holland or Scandinavia, where people, or even India, where people speak dozens of languages, many languages fluently, and they keep their own language. And they were going to the wrong places, and as you say, they reproduce colonial practices, and it's quite extraordinary. But remember, we're seeing that exactly now. America is reproducing Iraq War, India-Iran War. It's reproducing imperialism, 19th century imperialism. So these are larger questions. Why do? So China, it reproduces colonial practices. And of course, some of it's because, it's not a blue water colony. It's right next door. It's our neighbor. It's always been part of China. All this rhetoric, this narrative they have, that's obviously a major reason. But we have failed to explain to China what you're doing is colonial. And I want to just make a little point there. I don't know if it would help. If we were able to say to China, look, don't worry about the legal definition of colonialism. There may be a legal argument that Tibet is a colony, that it was never part of China. But let's put that argument to one side. There clearly is a very strong argument for that. But colonizing, colonialist, these words mean the way you rule a place. You have one foreign group that comes in and tells another foreign group what to do. That's pretty straightforward. That's they don't seem to get that part of it. They can say, well, it's not a colony, it was always part of China, whatever they claim, which is clearly not quite true. But they need to be explained. You're using colonizing methods. Why are all the heads of every organization Chinese? Why are people being made to learn Chinese? I think you're right. This is a message which we have failed to communicate so far.
I don't know whether Tibetan kind of like choosing the middle way path, whether that kind of like is their kind of feeling about Tibet as well, in a sense that I think Tibetans sort of accepted China as the overlord, sort of, in a way, when we kind of like decided that the middle way path and having autonomy, genuine autonomy, is the right way forward. And I think even as a Tibetan, I would probably think like, if the genuine autonomy works, it's probably livable. But we know that at the moment, things that there's less genuine autonomy. They're even trying to reverse everything that they promised in their constitution, well as this 17-point agreement and things like that. So, I mean, who or what do you think drives these kind of like policies? Do you think in China, is it just the kind of the academics coming up with new ideas and then the government implementing, or government feels there's real danger that if the Tibetans keep their identity, that there would be more kind of protests like in the 2008 and 1998 and things like that, 1997?
Oh, these are really good questions, and I can't really answer very clearly. But I think I have I think it's very complicated. I think that, if you imagine a leader, especially a paramount leader of an authoritarian system like Xi Jinping, they only have so many hours in the day to look at a problem, and they're going to spend only a short time on maybe second level problems, and probably Tibet is still second level to them. They're not going to spend days and weeks thinking about Tibet policy. So that's quite, and they might make a critical decision very quickly, I'm sure they do. I'm sure Xi Jinping does. But basically, they're going to be manipulated by people below them.
Yeah.
So this manipulation, and those people are going to say, well, we've decided there are only three choices. There's this information and that and this. And do you think, Comrade Jinping, do you think we should do this one or this one? Mm-hmm. Actually, one Tibetan once flew from China to a very high level guy to America, I won't say where, and asked to meet me. And he said, so I went to meet him, of course. Mm-hmm. And he said, look, the only thing that can change the party leadership, Xi Jinping, is if one of us can get a report to him that lands on his desk, that is one of those three choices. Okay. And he said he could write that report. He was trying to get a report to suggest a policy, and he had a reasonable chance that it would get to the desk of Xi Jinping if he could. But then there would be two or three others. Now, and we talked about that a bit. So he confirmed that that's really what happens. The question is which, shall we say, let's call them factions. Which faction is able to get its three reports on the table? Okay. And then which one will he choose? Well, that's going to be manipulated by the people around him as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think my Tibetan friend who came to see me ever was able to get his report onto the table. It would have been cut down way lower in the system. Mm. But I fear it's a great tragedy that he didn't get it there. But I think that what we're looking at in Tibet policy is an internal coup. Mm-hmm. So a coup d'etat that happens inside the system. And what I think happened is that after Tiananmen Square in 1989, they threw out all the United Front people because they cooperated with the students, Yang Minfu and people, and they replaced them with new United Front leaders who I've never really quite understood who was the big player in that. They were younger, they weren't Lao Shizangrong, they weren't people who'd worked in Tibet or minority areas, nationality areas in the 50s, they didn't know the languages. And I think those people, the people on the Tibet desk, later set up and people like that, realized that this is an opportunity for them to make their careers. And the way they made their careers, I'm just guessing, is by saying, we're going to take over Tibet policy. Now, United Front didn't probably run Tibet policy at that time. It was probably just one of many agencies. But somehow people in the Tibet desk managed to persuade the top leadership that they should be the lead people on Tibet because there have been demonstrations and they probably said, and they're international, you need us, we're the experts. And those people set up the third forum with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao in 1994, third forum on Tibet work. And that's the one that decided all Tibet policy must be based on denouncing and attacking His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, in person. That never really happened before in the Reform era. And everything must be done in order to encourage Chinese to come in, or Chinese entities, Chinese institutions to work in Tibet. So, and everything must be done to control monasteries. So this is a three-pronged method: in investment from inland China, crack down on monasteries and monks and nuns, attack His Holiness, that's the main thing, blame His Holiness for everything. And then Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao must have been behind this.
Yeah, because I'm kind of surprised by that, in the sense that at the time they're still trying to talk with Tibet, talk with the Dalai Lama in up to 2010 sort of thing.
Well, they don't talk during the 90s, late 90s.
Yeah.
So Third Forum takes over. United Front becomes the lead agency on Tibet. It's extremely hardline. And then we get the thing that Wang Lishong has pointed out, and the Punsok Wangyal, Pung Wang had pointed out, that those people behind that anti-Dalai Lama shift, hardline shift, their careers depend on keeping that line. If that line is changed, they're going to be out. So then we can imagine that they start stovepiping information going up to the top leadership that is only their information. So things saying, well, Dalai Lama's quite mild, he's quite open, there's a middle way thing. Things saying that probably don't even reach the top desk. Instead, they put in, Ju Wei Chun, and people saying it's all a trick, don't trust the Dalai Lama. So then the man at the top, whoever it is by then, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, they're getting probably very, very limited information, which is coming basically from this faction that Wang Lishong and Pun Wang, the late Pun Wang, called the splittism clique. The people who want to say there's a splittist threat, there's all a threat, they're all trying to, make Tibet independent, don't leave them. So I suspect there was that kind of coup which took over Tibet work, and then by 2010 took over Amdo Kam Tibet policy as well, by this very hardline crew, and they've managed to control information above them as well. That's my guess.
But I suspect, the leaders themselves, they meet with many foreign leaders, and we always ask them to raise Tibet questions and to put forward the kind of exile perspectives on these things. But I guess those information probably fell on deaf ears with these leaders, so they are suspicious because Tibet is being raised at such high level.
That's true.
What is that how it is, how they see it, or they rather listen to these hardcore United Fronts rather than Western leaders or people coming there telling them, "Oh, Dalai Lama is a nice man, you should talk to him."
Yeah. Somebody one of them once, one of these Chinese I had one Chinese guy who used to come and see me, very interesting intellectual, who worked for state security, I think, in a think tank, Kiko it's called. And I think it was him who said to me, what these Tibetans need, I think he said what you need is a Kissinger.
Okay.
So you need an intermediate. You're absolutely right. There are Westerners who are influential, who at certain stages in history can change the thinking, but not really change the thinking, but they can make a deal. They can say, if you support this, America will bring you technology or something like that. And Kissinger was able to do this. And he said, what you need is a Kissinger. It doesn't work when you send, Bill Clinton. It worked a little bit, but, Keir Starmer, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't help. But yeah, if you there's certain kinds of figures who can do it, but who can build up that relationship and make the Chinese leader think, I might get something out of this. This guy can, this guy has an interest to keep his word. But that's very rare. It takes a long time to build up. We haven't seen that happen in the Tibet case, really. And we haven't seen people who are really smart, shall we say smart enough to quite see how Tibet can be something you could go to the Chinese with and say, look, you've got a point. You don't want your country to be dismembered. I could arrange that for you, but in return, you'd have to do X, Y, and Z. Now, no, there's nobody who has the credibility to do that, because the ones that go and the Westerners that claim to do that, they're
Yes.
basically nobodies.
Yeah.
They're the people. The problem is the people who come to help Tibet. Oh, I shouldn't say this, but they're not always. They're people who failed somewhere else often.
Well, I'm
not
thinking
big
more
players.
like, when the world leaders kind of meet, and they often like try and ask them to.
Yeah, but those world leaders, they tend to signal
Sure.
human rights,
Yeah.
So there's this problem with human rights, that it's a code for saying don't worry about it in real political terms, as you know. So they're coding their message about Tibet to be second order importance, not moral, valuative, not really strategic. So a lot of the NGOs, Tibet NGOs, are trying to turn the conversation back to strategic issues, which is it's smart, but. And I have to say that you don't see the mainstream political people doing that, outside the NGOs. But you're starting to see it, certainly happening in India now. Of course, a lot of strategic people in India are thinking more about Tibet again, certainly after Galwan, the disaster at Galwan. And also, 2 think tanks in DC have brought out Tibet reports, CSIS. I think, and maybe Brookings. That's the first time that's ever happened. So there's a slight change happening, but it may be too late. But some of the American thinkers are starting to think, oh yeah, Tibet, they're going to think that because of the Sangpo Dam, the hydroelectric issue. They're all starting to rethink, as NGOs have been saying forever, water. So that is happening, but so we're going to start to see more serious thinking about Tibet by serious people, which isn't just human rights. But whether it's going to happen in time, whether it's going to translate into the kind of much higher level policy, the sort of trading that we're talking about, that's quite a way off.
I think like when I look at all the dam buildings in part of Tibet, I don't think it's for domestic electricity use. I personally think it's more for AI and data mining and things like that, because they need the electricity, they need the storage of data in a cool place and things like that. So maybe I feel like, maybe the likes of the Brookings and these, who are often all about financial gains, and they're probably working for the big companies like Tesla and Microsoft and these kind of things, trying to get information about China and stuff. Maybe for them, probably more worried about China's technological advance in AI, if they have this kind of like easy, free, almost like free resource that they can use to create like massive mainframes and technological infrastructure.
But that's, in a way, that's quite sort of positive direction, because it's moving Tibet from being a conversation for those kind of people about human rights, which they think of as, let's be honest, minor, unfortunately, and to being a conversation about a strategic issue, sort of security, alternative security type of issue, non-standard security. So it's moving into, should we say, a part of conversation in the West, and certainly in China, that is more conducive to a serious political consideration. So, but the question is that going to happen in time, before things are too late? Because things are rapidly deteriorating in some senses, as you mentioned, in terms of language and so on. I don't think the Chinese want to eliminate Tibetan language or eliminate Tibetan people. It's of course not, or religion. They want to keep these things, but in a very tame, managed, a minor way. But there is still a race against time. And then there's a political race. Who will the Chinese be negotiating with, if they ever even think of negotiating, once His Holiness is no longer with us, and so on, and His Holiness has opted for the interregnum system, for the reincarnation system. That will leave a gap in terms of might leave a gap in terms of a major figure. So the drift of Tibet to being taken more seriously, which we can see around the Sangpo hydropower issue. It's not a dam, really, it's more hydropower, but it involves dams as well, is happening, moving Tibet in a direction that might be more conducive to, shall we say, serious discussion. But that may not be happening in time.
I think recently, like you said, like in the situation with Dam, and also some border skirmishes with Indian, and this India is slightly kind of like seems more now, even kind of like in terms of people who are taking interest and well study about Tibet, has kind of feels like recently there's more increase. I don't know whether you also felt that as well. Um, and is there any kind of like in India you feel like this academic or this who are taking greater interest on like the security of India, well as this in terms of with Tibet issue?
Yeah, certainly, very good point. We're certainly seeing a very big uptick in Indian interest, more than interest, serious study, mainly women,
Yeah.
very, very interesting women, female Indian scholars, younger scholars, who are really thinking about Tibet in quite serious ways, modern Tibet, contemporary Tibet, not just the kind of religious tradition. And we see as well as, so we see some university programs which young Tibetans are also in. And we see a lot of activity on social media coming out of India, which is quite a kind of serious following of what's happening. We also see kind of what should we call sub-military discussions in Indian public space by ex-military people or military type people, you know, like Renada and people like that, much more than before, because they see after Galwan that they really do have a security issue which is Tibet related. And very interesting people like Jabin Jacob in Delhi saying the whole India issue cannot be resolved until India recognizes that there is no real historical solid basis for China's claim to Tibet. So here's a major scholar, China expert, and he's not an apologist. He's not saying, oh, we have to consider just China, you know, not like the 1950s approach of Panika or someone. There's and he's not a polemicist. He's not a political activist or something. So we're seeing real rethinking going on in India. But it's still, a lot of Indian media coverage is still about, oh, the China threat, and it's all lies, and they're inhumane, and so on. Very colourful, but not really always deeply focused. But a lot of more interesting footage is happening. A lot of more interesting writing is happening. So whether it's translating into real rethinking about policy in India, we don't really know yet.
Because also, I mean, the border issue is like with India, Bhutan, and this is still unresolved because China won't budge on what they think is Tibet and India kind of maybe assisting on the McMahon line or something, the line of control, which is also, I think, like, you know, long as that thing is there, they have to, like, you know, come to real kind of understanding of what they believe, whether it's Tibet should be part of China or not, or have it as a buffer zone, like, you know, the Tibetan kind of proposed.
Yeah, well, I think people who are really good on this, like Matthew Ackister, would say that that China is basically, I don't want to say provoking, but constantly probing India, so that on these issues, the border, line of virtual control, claims to Arunachal and so on, in order to put India on the defensive. And that there's a kind of higher strategic logic, which is quite low level in a way, which is we just keep them on their toes. We're always coming with a new claim, a new patrol that goes across the border, a new complaint, or we'll rename some mountains in Arunachal or something. We'll constantly keep India on the back foot. And the main way to do this, one could say, well, what's the purpose of that? Well, you could say the main purpose is you don't want India to change its position on Tibet. So if you phrase it like that, as that's a major core interest for China, which it pretty much says, then you see how important Tibet is. And you also see that the Indians have some advantage there. They have real potential advantage. They're the players on the. It's not America that is the big deciding factor on Tibet. It's India. So, as I think everybody realizes. So these are, and India tends to have been allowed to be in the defensive, reactive. And of course, a lot of people are saying this, a lot of Indian scholars are saying this as well. India needs to have a more proactive approach on some of these issues, but very difficult to do. But China is extremely good at kind of misdirecting, you know, making you think, oh, I have to worry about they're going to take my land or they're going to change the border or something. But maybe you're just being pushed by them into that kind of emotional reaction instead of calculating what your assets are and what you could be pushing for. And I should mention there that I think applies to the reincarnation issue. I would, at least as a thought exercise, I would say that the Chinese, let's imagine they don't care about the reincarnation at all. Let's imagine that they're not really worried about the next Dalai Lama, let's say. They think they will have things under control by then. And that this is just an opportunity for them to make a lot of noise about it, to say we demand that every country in the world acknowledge that only we have the right to do this. Now, you know, 100 of the 190 countries, 80 will say, yes, you do. That's already a plus, a gain for them. And the ones that won't, basically America won't say that, but then they can picture that as America's an enemy. That's helpful too. And then there'll be countries in the middle that will like the British and maybe the Indians. And then they can use that as what I call the Trojan horse strategy. You put up a fake issue that you don't really care about in order to push other countries to concede to you. And if they don't concede, you say, you have to give us something. Otherwise, we will accuse you of being anti-Chinese. This is what they did with the British.
That's like one China policy that they do it all the time, I guess.
Yeah, so they're very, very good at this kind of, shall we say, chess playing. You know, they're playing on a different level while they're making you think that you should worry about the reincarnation. It's just probably a kind of game for them.
Yeah, and then I think, to me, a lot of the Western politicians and they seem to fall for it because it's not a really issue for them to say, oh, we believe in one China or whatever. To me, or Tibet is like, what's his name? David Miliband changing sovereignty from like suzerainty to sovereignty for him is nothing.
Yeah, it was,
for Tibetans, it's a big deal.
It was a disaster.
Yeah.
With China, it was a big deal. Forget Tibetans. China, that's exactly what I meant actually by this Trojan horse theory, that they have been saying you mustn't meet the Dalai Lama, you're not allowed, we don't allow. It's not important actually. But what's important is eventually you will get a concession from Britain in return for meeting the Dalai Lama. So they went to the British behind the scenes and said, well, you met the Dalai Lama, you insulted us, we demand you show you are not anti-Chinese, change your view on Tibetan sovereignty, on China's sovereignty in Tibet. And David Miliband did. And I think
he got nothing for it.
He got nothing. He didn't even, Foreign Office phoned me up 3 days before and said, what do you think our minister is going to do this? What do you think the consequences will be? I said, disastrous. And they said, well, we think that too, but nobody's listening to them, you know, these lower level people. And of course, it was a disaster. And I said, what has he asked for return? And they said to me, nothing. He says the Chinese won't give us anything. It's not worth asking. So that's the quality of British diplomacy. This is an indictment of British diplomatic capacity, memory, intellect, just to, complete incompetence about how to deal with higher level diplomacy. And that's what happened. So that's a reality. We have to deal with that.
But I feel sadly that these things seems to be happening more and more. And I think recently I admire the Japanese Prime Minister because she stuck to her kind of like gun that if anything happens to Taiwan, Japanese will be drawn in that sense. And China has been trying really hard to kind of push them back on that. But I think at the moment, she's got more popularity. So I'm hoping that she won't back down from kind of like China's what you say, kind of like low level kind of threats to try and get something else.
Well, I suppose, there's a kind of level of politics when one says, I would like this politician to do this or do that. But there's another level where you have to say, or somebody has to say, well, it's very difficult for her to do this or that, or him to do this or that, because there'll be punishment, there'll be reaction, they'll be penalized by China or by their business lobby or some other, they have so many factors to consider. And the tradition in the kind of, shall we say, the NGO community is not to think about that. It's to say, well, I make my demand. I demand my prime minister complain to China or whatever. But probably we should be saying, well, what's that prime minister going to be thinking about? He's got to balance trade and military and, environmental issues. We should be helping that politician get a all-round strategy. So within which they might ask for what you want on Tibet, but we can say, in return, you could give China this, or China will take revenge by doing that. You could handle that revenge or that reaction in this or that way. We're not very good at that. We're good at this is a problem of single issue politics. Those of us who are involved in one issue, we say, well, we want this to happen and we push for it. But that's not how the politician experiences. They're balancing it with 20 other things. So we would probably be better off if we tried to role play their situation and say, well, if you ask for this, say on Tibet, you could give that and you could deal with it this way, and the way they'll come back is this. We should probably sort of gameplay a complete sort of scenario for those people. Maybe that would be more effective.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be quite difficult, but
It's very difficult. You'd have to talk to those kind of people. I don't know those. I'm not an expert at that.
Sure. And so I mean, like now we are sort of quarter-way through the 21st century, and there's, I mean, a lot of things happening in terms of changes to the world. We got at the moment a hot war happening in Iran. And how do you see, what Donald Trump is doing at the moment is affecting kind of Chinese thinking in terms of we got kind of the ongoing war in Ukraine. We see what Donald Trump did to Maduro in Venezuela, and now he's doing to Iran. Some view this as him kind of like isolating the excess of evil in those what do you call it, the kind of like the alliance with Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, Venezuela, these kind of Cuba, I guess, in same kind of the kind of communist bloc sort of.
He's not touching North Korea.
Yeah, I know. But do you still feel that this is China will see this as like a threat to them as well? I mean, of course, it's affecting their kind of maybe oil. I don't know, but I think recently I did see that Iran is maybe letting some vessels go with oil.
No, Iranian tankers are going with oil to China, so they'll get some. Well, everybody is, I think, following this and knows just as much as I do. But one of the things that's happening now is that historians are being vindicated. We're in a very strange period. I don't think this happened much in my life before, where suddenly you realize, oh my God, those people who were going on about history and how you should study history and history repeats or history rhymes or you learn things from the past, suddenly that's true again. Because in a very, we were people like me, I'm 70, I brought something, we were brought up in this kind of post-Second World War era when it was taken for granted that the real drive of humanity was to be more humane and have maybe democracy, but at least have human rights and international law. And it took 50 years sort of to achieve that, and they roughly did. It was taken for granted that everyone would celebrate that more or less in different ways, including even China. And we now see under Trump that that's just it's kind of imaginary in the sense, not imaginary, it can be destroyed overnight, which is basically what he's destroying the international system, replacing a values system with an interest system. So that means that we're back in a 19th century kind of era, and maybe some people would say much earlier than that, you know. So suddenly we have to turn to historians and say, my God, we all thought there was progress, but it turns out to be kind of cyclical or imaginary, and it turns out to have been very hard fought for and very easily lost, this idea of value-based relations that we had. And so that's really very, very shocking. But it does mean, okay, we better talk to historians about, or people who remember, or people who've read about this, some politicians have, you know, how did we handle the rise of the extreme right wing in the 1930s, for example, or how did we handle the outbreak of World War I? What should we have done better? Which is really a great power problem. You know, when you have competing powers, World War I type of situation, collapsing empires or competing empires. So we maybe need to think about it in that way, because everything you said about Trump is really a description of a very primitive, crude imperial ethos. You know, I take people in my region, my area, anything around me, I have it, it's mine, I can invade it at will. And anything that threatens it, I can invade it. Well, Iran may be a bit too far for him, but they obviously see Israel as a kind of outpost of their American empire. So it's somehow within that frame. So Xi Jinping is already well ahead of us on that, because he was going on and on and on about, you know, bipolarity and superpower competition years ago, before Trump. And Trump has just proved him right, really, that Chinese theory was roughly right. There are competing global powers. So the Chinese were well prepared for that. So I think it helps them as much as it troubles them. It reinforces a narrative. It makes China seem much better, much more careful about its decisions. And China will come out of this relatively well. It has an economic risk that you've touched on. But this is really extremely destabilizing for the whole Western project, what's happening now. Because we talked earlier about China being colonialist, no question that we're right. And we failed to communicate that really successfully to Chinese people. I think that's one of our failures as a kind of group of people who think about Tibet or Xinjiang or other parts. We failed to communicate that to ordinary Chinese people. This is a colonial type way of ruling a place in Tibet or Xinjiang or Inner Mongolia. But we've also failed to persuade people that democracy is really quite what it claims to be. It's not performing very well now. So that's a really, really, really important historical and potentially disastrous historical development that we're going to have to, our next generation, we hope will be able to solve that problem somehow and recover some of the lost possibilities of the, shall we say, the democratic method. But now it's sort of disintegrating.
One thing, like earlier when you're talking about, like, you know, what the Trump was doing in terms of, but I felt like, you know, just before Trump came, there was within China, there was a bit more sort of like what the people who used to call the wolf warriors. They were like talking, like, you know, they're talking China up like China is already the kind of number 2 or number 1 sort of superpower. And then I think they are the ones I felt like, you know, at the time who are pushing this narrative that, you know, they're in competition, direct competition with America to become the number 1 superpower. But I feel like since Trump, they have toned down the wolf warrior, and also I think since the kind of like the tariffs, the huge tariffs that Donald Trump had put on them and sort of thing.
Well, Trump has done that work for them, really, I would say. So I mean, I'm someone who thinks that the Chinese are generally their politicians are smarter than ours.
Mm-hmm.
And I find their narrative offensive, you know, the way they write and talk, and Tibet's always part of China and Dalai Lama is this and that. It's offensive.
Yeah.
It lowers their, it's not really worthy of them as decent human beings to do that. But as overall political animals, they're much smarter than we're seeing in a lot of our countries. We do see some smart politicians, you know, maybe Scandinavia, maybe Spain now, Portugal. I don't have expertise in that. But generally we're failing, and generally they're somehow better at sending people out to find out what we're doing than we are at sending people out to find out what they're doing. So I think I generally try to take the attitude, at least sort of, shall we say, intellectually, as an exercise in saying their concerns are legitimate. You know, they have interest, they're worried, they see threats, they're terrified of the Soviet Union collapse happening to them. Fair enough. They you know, that makes sense that they should worry about that. And we should probably acknowledge that, but we should recognize they have legitimate concerns, okay, and that they have sometimes much better understandings of certain things than we do, international things. They're more realistic, more honest, in a way, but they're not honest about, should we say, Tibet, things like that. Right. But sometimes in other issues they are, and we should try to find the difference between the issues where they've got a lot to teach us, and the issues where we might be able to contribute. Their blind spot, let's call them blind spots. I think for, this may be a bit overgeneral, I think for communists, religion and culture, if it's someone else's culture, not yours, and nationality are blind spots. Communism can't deal with them. I think Marx couldn't deal with them. Yeah. I think Marx couldn't fathom them. He's a secularist. I see other people like this, who are very secular. They can't understand religion. You know, it's just a weird thing to them, and they don't like it. And I think that's generally true of communists trying to work out how to deal with people who are different, people who have strong cultures, people who have religion. They keep getting it wrong. They keep making crazy policies that are just going to backfire or do a lot of damage. So I think that's what we're seeing, but it doesn't mean that all their policies are wrong. Yeah, sure. I think Dalai Lama has tried to point that out many times. Yeah. You know, he says there's something in socialism, it can be helpful if we get this right. There are other things that it gets totally wrong. I think there's something in that.
So, like, for me, I was like you said, like pre-millennium, sort of like we were all kind of optimistic, like the third world debt ending, you know, lots of changes in the world. And also I think, you know, if like for example, Hong Kong, if one country, two system worked as it's supposed to work in like Hong Kong, I think the Tibetans and even Taiwanese would maybe change their mind slightly about, like, you know.
That's true.
Because we were at the time, we were kind of like optimistic that, you know, if that works, then, you know, genuine autonomy might even work for Tibetans as well.
That's very true.
I think that that changed with like the national security law and what's happened since in Hong Kong. It seems like now Hong Kong is more or less no longer kind of like the free, independent kind of city-state that we assumed like it will be.
Yeah, Hong Kong and Xinjiang have been, you know, real disasters, terrible developments. But again, I sort of see that as a coup by internal power, internal faction that is very hardline, that somehow persuades Xi Jinping or whoever that you have to be really, really hardline with these people. I mean, I have a very simplistic view in Hong Kong. If I kind of imagine this, we could say this is a fantasy, a kind of counterfactual. If the students hadn't been violent, you know, they had said, oh, we're going to be non-violent and not break windows or whatever, beat up policemen, maybe the hardliners wouldn't have been able to have an excuse to persuade the leadership to be so extraordinarily aggressive in Hong Kong. Maybe they would have done it anyway. But I think there's a lot of strategy that is confused on you know, on the, shall we say, the protest side, the democracy side. I think democracy movements are very, very weak on strategy. They're generally, we tend to provoke as much rather than make solutions. And I'm sympathetic to all those groups, but we're not very good on strategy of thinking what's. So I'll just give one example, one sort of theory about that, which is we tend to think of politics in single issue movements. We tend to think of politics as being about getting support, and we tend to think about support as being essentially PR, media, and a number of media gets politicians to support you. That's really what we're seeing. But I don't know that that is politics. I think that's one very narrow kind. Real politics might be getting interest, other groups to have common interests, trade unions, other countries, this party, that party. I think that that kind of interest-based politics, interest in the sense of common interest, alliances, common fronts, that hasn't really been developed. The last 20, 30 years, that's fallen out of favor. When I was young, that was the kind of politics that people tried to do. You build coalitions. I think coalition building hasn't been very strong in the West on single policy issues. And so I think that's been a weakness. But anyway, that's just a thought.
So like, I think I felt like you're slightly blaming the victim, like saying that, I hope if the students haven't been like violent or something. And it's similar in like, I guess, Tiananmen Square, it started off peaceful. I guess like most of these kind of protests, they start without any plan as such as where they wanted to go. They just want to change, that's it. They didn't think beyond that. And so I think, and also sometimes who instigate violence, it's very difficult to know in these protests because we go into protests and sometimes they do have kind of false flag kind of actors.
Yeah, that's true.
Who we never know is whether they start the...
Nepal, I think, that's what happened.
Like we see...
Yeah, I think Gen Z in Nepal, that looks like that may have been what happened, false flag.
Yeah.
Well, or something like that, provocateur. Yeah, it's true. It's very complicated. But we can learn, what do we learn from these things? Well, I'm not into victim blaming, you're quite right, but we have to sort of study things and say, okay, what can we do better? But it's very difficult now. We're in a very difficult phase of history.
And I feel like what happened in Tiananmen Square now, I think there's like, even all the people who have come to the West and they both seems to have like changed a lot. The people who are protesting in Tiananmen Square, maybe one or two still vocal about it, but most seems to have like, totally disappeared and changed with China. But even now, Hong Kong, now I feel like the student, even though I see recently, they were together when we were protesting against the Chinese embassy, mega embassy in near Tower of London. But I can see like slowly they're gonna probably disappear, just like the Tiananmen Square kind of protesters. Because we used to go to Tibetan demonstration, and we used to see the numbers slowly dwindling. Like
but we might, that tends to happen. But we might find, the advantage of, let's say, I don't like the word, this kind of democracy sort of half of the world, is that our systems are better at producing creative responses because we're less limited. We're much more limited in terms of discourses. We get told a story, you're like all these Americans who think America's the land of the free and the best country in the world. It's complete nonsense. But still, if we set aside the people who are absorbed by those narratives, which are really painful and should be forgotten, there's quite a lot of space for creative thinking in our democratic system. So, and in an authoritarian systems, maybe less. I mean, sometimes they will be more creative than us because they're just brilliant people. A lot of Tibet, that's what we see in Tibet, and we see it in China too. But still, we do have that possibility of coming up with new answers, new way to do politics, new ways to think about, You know, we shouldn't. We might decide that the best way to do politics is not to think that British politicians or American politicians are going to help anybody. You know, we could see that from Trump. Maybe we'll come up with a better solution. Maybe your peer group, your colleagues, your friends will sit down and say, okay, maybe that old style didn't work. Let's find a new way of thinking about how to get change in Tibet. You may come up with a better solution than any of us had.
Me, I was kind of like thinking, you know, like we were talking about like coalition building and stuff like that. I feel like, you know, even in exile, it's been very difficult for, I think, like, you know, the Tibetans, even the Hong Kong people, even like, you know, say, for example, the people who's kind of escaped after Tiananmen Square, even, I guess, the Xinjiang Uyghurs and stuff, to build like a real coalition to kind of like come up with a better solution to work together for change. Because I feel like there's still kind of like conflict within
you're
ourselves.
right. You're totally right. I was thinking of a different kind of coalition. I'm just vaguely imagining it, you know. And I just give that example again. When we were young and we were at university and we were all politically very active and we ran huge protests at university, we stopped the university a few times and stuff. Quite interesting, actually. We were trying to support, you know, workers in the university system or something. We weren't very ideological, we were post-ideological, fortunately. You don't want to be caught up in kind of Maoist ideology, but in those days, people talked about coalition as other social forces. Can you find another social force that will work with you on an issue, like a trade union movement? Of course, people don't think about that much now, but it's still an important force. Or industry. Could you get industry to say it's in your interests to work with us on Tibet? Could you get, you know, as you said, AI people? Now, I don't know how to do that. But that might be the productive kind of way to explore, to make a coalition of very powerful forces beyond political parties, which are very, very unreliable, very superficial, and not just. Of course, you should have a coalition with like-minded issues. Absolutely, no question about that. But I'm thinking of the larger social forces. Can you say, we have a shared interest with you? And can you say to politicians who empower you, there's a benefit for you in doing this, and you could trade this with something else? So this is maybe where we could kind of brainstorm.
So at the moment, I work for a trade union organization, and people working in the trade union, most of them are more sympathetic towards communists, because that's their kind of like thing. So I mean. So I always try to remind them, if there is like a communist, trade unions will be one of the first people they purge, right? Because they don't want any party or any organization which threatens their party. And but most trade unionists think like, you know, communism is like, I guess this kind of socialism, like state kind of control of all the economic means sort of thing, which they think just because the state controls it, it's going to share equally by the state. But despite all the kind of like communist country not working in that way, they're still kind of like more sympathetic towards they feel the kind of, I guess, the imperialists or the industrialists are the enemy rather than the communist party. So they're always sympathetic towards China in that sense, because it's communist, even though it's more capitalist in their kind of outlook.
So there I would say, okay, this is just an experiment. Okay, think how much communism, let's say Chinese communism, would gain in world stature and image and approval and soft power if it worked out a way to decolonize its own territories, to stop having to allow Tibetans to run their own lives, for example, or Uyghurs and others in Turkic people in Xinjiang and in Mongolia. Think how that would be I don't like the word revolution, but that would be a totally innovative move, and it would so much improve that. Their problem is soft power. They don't have a good image. They're not good at communicating outside. So think how much you could help the people you like so much by doing this. So that's.
I think we've kind of like always kind of as a Tibetan, that's one of the things that we thought we can give China. Like if they've negotiated with the Dalai Lama, if they can win over the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people, I think China. I mean, one whole Tibet and these areas will be probably much freer. They don't have to spend so much money to control it. But that the people inside Tibet who run it, for them the control means more money, for them more resources for them to do the control. If there is no need to, I guess the hardliners, for them is the benefit to stoke up the kind of separatist kind of danger.
Yeah, that's right.
Rather than
to overstate the risk.
Yeah. Rather than trying to have peace or much kind of like a more freedom. So I think this is this kind of, I find it like very strange in like how the politics of the whole world works. I guess it's the same in almost every country. Yeah. So in terms of like I guess we are coming near the end. What things do you see in the future like you can be optimistic about in the near future sort of thing, in terms of I mean for us at the moment, the kind of the policies, the recent policies of like kind of ethnic unity and kind of the Tibetan children's being taken to kind of schools in China and stuff. We see that as kind of like great danger for Tibetan identity. But hopefully, I think, people who grew up in this kind of system, I think like even us, we are brought in this country to study, but we still retain our kind of like the Tibetanness. And when we grow up, we become more kind of attached to what has been denied to us in a sense. So that kind of like sometimes gives me some optimistic that there will be children who will think the similar way, even if they are grown up in China, that they will think, I've been denied my identity, my rights, my culture, and they become much stronger, and they will have the instruments, the language, and kind of like the educational background and the knowledge of the system to fight even stronger. That gives me some kind of optimism, even though the situation looks bad at the moment. And also in terms of other kind of like, where the world is going, maybe there are like some pockets of revolution, like what happened in Nepal, even Bangladesh, and this, at the moment we don't know how that change is going to develop, but we see all the time that the younger generation of people kind of want certain changes, and maybe like people in China, once I think they come to a certain point, they will also try again, kind of like a new kind of revolutionary changes. So that kind of, I think, I'm trying to find some optimism in that. As a Tibetan, as they say, Tibet, you've probably heard that. So what do you see as like things you're going to change, maybe change for better? Or
Well, there's one change that's happening, which is, it fits in with the general, should we say, Marxist theory that action produces reaction, thesis produces antithesis. This is their theory, and they're right, of course, that's what we see. So we can apply that to what you're describing as well, that as the Chinese crack down, or they're being very aggressive now on Tibetan culture, not nearly as aggressive as in Xinjiang, but we've seen it there too, but it's very serious in Tibet on the cultural level. There will be a reaction. Now, that reaction, I don't mean necessarily protest or further self-immolations. I don't mean that kind of reaction, but I mean I am hearing from the few people that I talk to who are in contact with people inside Tibet who come out to talk to them and pass messages on to us or on to the other Dharamsala or something, that a lot of Tibetans are very upset about the current language policy, especially, and not just the language. Actually, some of them have sent messages saying, it's not the language, we need to learn Chinese, it's okay. It's the content, the fact that they're making, even in kindergartens, they have to learn about Chinese festivals, Chinese culture, Chinese this and that, and not just communist things, but Chinese things. That's upsetting people. So I don't want to say that I want people to be upset,
Sure.
but it's quite an important indicator.
Yeah.
It's quite, and now I don't know that this ever amounts to a situation where you get protest. But it doesn't have to, because China's pretty sensitive about that. It might get the message quite quickly. Now we have seen that there are people beginning to pick up on certain issues in Tibet about the restrictions on monks and about the new imposition of language policies in kindergartens and so on. It's starting to filter into the system. And you can you'll sort of see in the next couple of years, some Chinese academics will start to write things which say, oh, maybe we have to go back to including local culture in education or something like that. They did that 4 or 5 years ago, they were doing that. So these things might swing back a little bit. Now, whether they'll lead to major change, I don't know. But when you talk to people from China who are major figures or second level figures, but still major relative to us, and they're opposed to the current leadership, you do feel that things could change quite quickly. Probably not for the reasons we expect, but Xi Jinping maybe has played his cards too aggressively. Maybe he's been in power too long. Maybe some people don't like that. But much more importantly, maybe they're terrified because they're losing all their money on property sales, stuff like that. So we don't quite know, but I would say that there are quite interesting signs. As you promote the economic level of a people, then their critical capacity increases. They've got more leisure time, they're perhaps learning a bit more, exposed to a bit more media, and maybe they're spending more time talking to each other. So there are possibilities. And there's another possibility which I've written about quite a lot, hasn't really come true yet, maybe too late. But I did write this article for China File a couple of years or so ago, saying, well, I've always said this basically, but it seemed to be a bit stronger now. There's a kind of paradox. The Chinese refused to negotiate with the Tibetans, basically with His Holiness for a long time. But the longer they leave it, the more they need it. If we accept the premise that what they really need is the Dalai Lama to give in. They've said the Dalai Lama is responsible for everything. Well, there's a price to pay for that. If the Dalai Lama doesn't come out and support you, you've never really got the support you could have had. In other words, there must be people inside China saying, we need the Dalai Lama to concede. We really need that. And as he gets older, and as unfortunately his life comes to a close, that group will get stronger and stronger. Internally, China saying, you've got to make a concession, because we need this guy to say, our Panchen Lama is right, or whatever they want. Now, that's not a very attractive objective, but there is a sense, and I think Pemba Tsering is quite aware of this, quite interesting in how he sees it, that he senses that the Chinese need the Tibetans at this stage much more than before. That there's some lobby within the Chinese leadership that does want China to make a deal. Now, whether that deal would be good or of any benefit at all, of course, it wouldn't be at all good if the Chinese are just running it themselves. But it depends on Tibetan skill in negotiating and all kinds of things. If they're up to it, they could maybe squeeze something, some benefit out of that. So I see it in those ways. It's a constantly moving calculation for the Chinese. Should they give away a little bit for once? They never really have. There are, it's possible that they might, that school of thought that says, yeah, we should give something, we've all read about Professor Jin Wei. She's argued that for now 10, since 2013, 2014. She's been saying we ought to do that in China. So it's very difficult to say, but I wouldn't rule these things out. I think there's pressures on China as well, and the question is how skillful can people be in maximizing those pressures and getting benefit out of them. And of course, a lot of times it depends on India, really.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm not without hope at all. Actually, I think there's possibilities.
So while at TIN, a lot of publication on Tibet came out, like education in Tibet, about the Trojan nuns and this kind of thing. So how were their research, and how did you kind of like, I guess, finance the publications and things, and were they well received with academically and also in the general public or media?
Well, we're a team. We were a team, so it's all about team building, and we had big funding for a few years from an anonymous donor that was fantastic, that gave us one grant, I think, that enabled us to build the team. So maybe 10 people in London, Dylan knows all of them, and maybe 10 people overseas in the Kathmandu or in Dharamsala. And in that era, so there's just sort of three eras of information gathering for the people outside, like us, outside Tibet, about Tibet. There's an era, a Gendun Rinchen era, when people inside Tibet, like Gendun Rinchen, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, are sending incredibly rich information to people like TIN or Dharamsala or other organizations later, RFA, TCHRD, and so on. So there you're getting primary information from what are now called citizen journalists, Tibetans who are news gatherers secretly at huge risk, a lot of them, collecting material and sending it out. Now that material is very important. It's not because it's first-hand, it's because it's rich. It includes many different kinds of things. So the kind of things that Gendun Rinchen and people of that era are sending, it's not just human rights things, or someone's arrested or whatever. It's policies, it's policy documents, it's what people are saying, opinions, it's commerce, what's happening in the street, who's here, who's starting new companies. Those people who are in a situation, they have a much wider view. Sure. When we're outside a situation, we think, oh, I want to know about X, but X is only one of many things. So that era lasts from 1987, really, 88, till 1994, 95. Gendun Rinchen's in prison. He manages to get out because of international pressure, and then he escapes to India in 95 or something. Rigzin Chernyi, another great information gatherer, manages to get to India as well. It's impossible for them to continue because security is so strong. So the rich information era collected by Tibetans comes to an end by 94, 95. 97 we get the Panchen Lama's petition that comes to us from another route through China, actually. So then you get a period of a phase of knowledge which is about 15, 20 years, which is driven by escapees, the people who come across the mountains, the Himalayas, who walk across and escape, 2,000 or 3,000 a year, to Nepal and then into India, of whom a quarter are children, a quarter are monks and nuns, and the others are lay people. And among those people are political prisoners who've been released, or people who are. So then, for those 15, 20 years, information about Tibet is based on what those people tell us. And it's mainly then about human rights, what they experienced in prison and so on. So it starts to be, it's quite rich because it's first-hand, but is starting to become more confined to a certain kind of topics. And all the journalists go and interview them. So it's getting harder for us to get, rich knowledge, knowledge of these, exactly these other things like education, child welfare, people's views. That's getting a bit harder to get from that method. And then in 2008, the interview method comes to an end because the borders are sealed by the Chinese in the run-up to the Olympics that August, and fewer people can escape, fewer people to interview. So the journalists stop going to Dharamsala. Our people in Dharamsala, they don't have so much to interview. And so then we have to turn to the third phase, which is essentially open source, what we call open source, We're reading what the Chinese are saying themselves. So we had always used that, but that was always a backup, what we call triangulation, You hear this report from Tibet and you see something in a newspaper and then you hear it from an interview. But now that's our only method. So this is much slower. You only get positive news in Chinese media, of course, so you have to interpret it this way. Jamyang Norbu was so invaluable, so important, people like him, and other people who come from Tibet, they can interpret these things better, but it's very hard to verify things. But there is another source of information in this third phase, the open source phase, where there's no interviewees, no escapees really, or very few. And that's what I call anecdotal fragments, little news reports that you can't really back up, you don't know the context. That's what RFA and Dharamsala are getting these days, the last 20 years. Very interesting. There's been a protest here, there's been an arrest there, somebody taken away for writing about his holiness on a phone, or little things. And actually, those come out through the media, Tibetan media essentially, or exile media or something, and they don't get picked up by the major media. Unless we put them together and put them in a big report for Human Rights Watch, kind of stuff that I do. Sometimes gets picked up, but they're human rights things, and they're only the worst things, because people take incredible risk to send those little fragments out, so they only send the most serious things. So there we're missing the kind of everyday things. The open source material sort of hints at the everyday things, but you never know what they are. So now we have a different kind of problem. We've got quite a lot of these fragments which turn out to be really very high level of accuracy. Of course, people exaggerate the significance or whatever, but the core information's usually right, usually turns out to be right. But we're not getting everyday stuff. So the everyday stuff we try to do open source is quite difficult, takes a long time. But we're gradually getting, learning to find how can we tell what policy is going on. And as you say, we can see now that there really is a crackdown on language issues, and the religion is getting tighter and tighter, those kind of issues too, especially for children. Religious belief for children is being cracked down on. So it's all, the methods we use have to change. In the 90s, we had multiple methods. You could have methods from inside Tibet, you could have some open source, you had SWB then, a famous service that the BBC and other people supplied for translation of Chinese open source documents, and you had interviews. You could talk to people. So that's really how we worked in the tin era, combination of those. Now we work in the open source era. I have a team that I work with all the time. We meet twice a week for 3 or 4 hours at a time, and we just go through Chinese news articles. And that's how we discovered, we don't discover much. It's very, very, very slow work. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year we say, I think we can make we can make a judgment from these thousands of articles. That's how we discovered about the Chinese annexation of the north of Bhutan, exactly. It was just by what's on the front page of Tibet Daily. Why is some obscure village, why is Wu Yingzhe, party secretary, visiting this village? Why is it on 3 successive days on the front page of the Daily? No reason given. There must be a reason. Took us a year to find out. Took us a year to find out and another year to check and so on. And then we discovered there's hundreds of articles about relocation of nomads to, near Lhasa from nomad areas. And they're all voluntary, and you start thinking, well, hundreds of articles, why are there so many? Why are they continually repeating this? And why do they continually repeat that it's voluntary? Well, maybe it is. We actually think that a lot of the resettlement, the relocation is voluntary. But this particular one, high altitude relocation, a little bit suspicious because the entire village goes. So when you go, I say to Dr. would you like to move to Lhasa? You say yes, could be voluntary, no, perfectly possible. But a whole village, and then we started to do a bit of mathematics. Well, how many of these, you know, I don't remember how many I found, maybe 200 articles saying whole village agreed. I also found that in 15%, we made a corpus and analyzed it a little bit. 15% of them, those articles included words that showed Carters had had to visit house by house to have heart-to-heart exchanges with the villagers. And you start thinking, that's a bit interesting. Why did they have to visit so many times? And so you explore it. And eventually we found one area in Zayul, I think it's in Zayul, where they had published a Chinese agency that had sent its own staff to Zayul, had sent a Chinese guy, and he had persuaded some village to move. And he was so proud of it, this Chinese guy. He had 3 articles published about how brilliant he was in persuading, you know, encouraging Tibetans to move. And he had a video made by CCTV showing it. They filmed it. Absolute proof that this was basically pressure. Sure. So it's not force, you know, but it's really strong pressure. And so then we were able to say, well, look, 50% of articles say heart-to-heart talks. That's quite high. And 100% of people agree. That's a bit odd. And now we have a case in Zayul where it's quite clear that there was extreme pressure placed on one man, one Nakpa in this village who didn't want to go. And it's quite open in the video. And eventually he goes, and you don't, you know, it's very unlikely that he was really happy to go. So you can therefore say this isn't really voluntary. So, but it's a very long process, very long process. So now I'm writing a book that I finished on yesterday, day before yesterday, after about 4 years, which is about the treatment of nuns from Larunga and Yachenga. So as you know, there were 10,000 nuns there, and half of them were evicted in 2016 or 2017, a bit after, and they were sent home. So what happened to these nuns? So this is the question that I want to answer. We found one procurement document in 2021. My team is half Tibetans, half Westerners, and myself, Matthew Eckerster, and Ron Schwartz, and then 2 Tibetans who don't use their real names. One of them very good in Chinese, and he spotted a procurement document saying this Chamdo, I think it's Riuche and Tingchen Zong counties, they want to commission video monitoring systems. They're openly asking people to supply this, contractors, to make a bid, for monitoring persuaded returnees from Yachen. So what does persuaded returnees mean? It actually is never seen this phrase before, my Tibetan colleagues. Very strange. So we started to explore this phrase, and we found about 106 articles which use a phrase like persuaded returnee or something like that. And this is called keyword searching method. So, and we discover they're all almost all nuns, a few monks from Yachen or Larunga who've been deported from those encampments. And the ones in the TAR, about 1,000 were taken back to the TAR. First, they were put in detention centers. We know about that from fragments that RFA got at the time. But the others were put in what I call home confinement. They were sent to their homes. And these video cameras are used to monitor them. I don't know if the video cameras are around the home. We've seen pictures of their homes because the Chinese published photographs of their officials giving them presents and things like that. But maybe the cameras are around the village or something. We don't know. But we know they're monitored and they're visited by officials, and they're basically restricted. They can't go back to a nunnery.
House arrest.
So this is quite remarkable. It's quite a small group. But why are they targeting this group? They're not a threat. And there's no political activity in Larunga or Yachenga, no history of that. They're nuns. They're on their own. So it's very strange. So it's a change in the way the authoritarian system is working. It's starting to target very small groups, not because they're an obvious threat, but maybe just to set an example to others, or maybe because the local Tibetan cadres want to exhibit their importance or their energy or their show that they're still active. You know, this is a theory that the state self-replicates perpetually, continually finds a reason to perform. It's the state to monitor, manage people. We don't really know, but what I think is important here is that there's no visible footprint. You're not going to see this on satellite images.
Sure.
You're not going to get reports of this on RFA because it's very low key. People shouldn't take the risk of reporting about this to send news out. But it could start to happen to other groups as well. You know, why choose nuns? I mean, it's insane. But so I'm looking at the way the Chinese state is getting much smarter, much more low profile, less violence. It was very violent when it detained them in 2016, very abusive, but now it's getting, especially in Qinghai and Gansu, they're not using violence on these nuns. They might be with other people, we don't know. And I'm sure they could go back to violence at any time. But generally, we're seeing them getting smarter. And that means the media will see less of it. So we have to adapt our techniques to being able to trace these kind of changes. Sorry, very long answer to that.
I think these are kind of like some of the dangers people in exile are now saying about transnational aggression and surveillance by the Chinese states. Well, like, you know, we see like them pursuing the Hong Kong demonstrators and stuff really publicly, like, you know, even issuing 1 million Hong Kong dollars or whatever. So I guess this is...
Yeah, I think Tibet is more, it's not a case of dramatic abuse at the moment. It will come and go. It's the case of they seem to use it as a laboratory for these more subtle techniques. So I think we tried to do this in tin as well, in the tin days before tin was destroyed by later people. But we try to focus on these quieter things that aren't so obvious because they might have much larger effect. You know, and we're seeing that now. Now people are paying attention to language and culture. That's quite important. I think in the language and culture thing, people are missing something. All the articles we're seeing, it's excellent that there's been a lot of coverage, but it tends to be about assimilation, which is a kind of very emotive term, but I think it's probably right. But I think what's important is there's one clause in this new law, I think it's 32 or something, which says every local administration is required to introduce practices that advance ethnic integration. And it says that you have to introduce practices, so that's the important word, that lead to people of different ethnicities playing together, working together, studying together, living together. Now, I think that's really important. That's practical. It's going to be invisible outside. We're not going to really notice it. It means that they're going to do things like urban planning will mix communities. No Tibetan quarter. There might be a tourist one left in Lhasa, but they will be deliberately saying this classroom has to have Chinese children and Hui children and Tibetan children mixed, so they all speak Chinese. This leisure center has to include Tibetans and Chinese and Hui and Salas and whatever. This living area, it's going to be practical. That's where the Chinese are really good at policy. And that's the kind of thing we tend to miss because we're looking at big picture words, which is true too, like assimilation and so on. This is going to, these practical things like giving incentives to Tibetan graduates to go and work in Chinese cities. It's not a human rights issue. It's not true that they're forced to go. They may not have much choice, maybe. There are not many jobs back home, but they're going to find ways to do this that don't really fit our human rights conventional frames, not dramatic abuses. Incentives, maybe changing the narrative, maybe saying, oh, you'll have much better opportunities in China or whatever it will be. We're going to have to learn to track those and explain how those will have a much larger effect.
So, you know, I think in one sense, if they are really kind of like trying to integrate China in hoping that the Tibetan will kind of like turn Chinese or Sinicize, I think it could maybe backfire. I feel like, our kind of like our own perception of our own culture, if it is much more relaxed and this, I think people might hopefully turn the other way, in sense like they might become more kind of like settled in Tibet.
Yeah, well, it will
Just-
backfire, but the question is how much and
Yeah.
will
And
they?
how long? Because
How long? Yeah.
at the moment, I feel there isn't like too many Chinese who's like seems to be truly like sympathetic and like mass to Tibetan culture or what this, because they don't seem to have the
Oh, they're very sympathetic to Tibetan Buddhism,
yeah,
hugely. But we should talk about Tibetan studies a little bit.
yeah, sure.
I think the emergence of modern Tibetan studies is an incredibly successful, exciting development. And it's really established now. It's really very impressive. And there's like we're going to have this conference, I think I mentioned it, in Kathmandu, the whatever 18th International Tibetan Studies Seminar or something, and be 600 people, and half of them will be young and half of them will be modern, which is total change, doing modern studies. And a lot of them will be Tibetans. Like I just got a message last night from so in my team, I have another team that I run at SOAS. I have, 6 or postdocs, and I think 4 of them are Tibetans.
Okay.
I think 3, I think they're from Tibet originally, but they did PhDs in the West. They are you cannot match these people. They're just outstanding scholars. Now they were trained maybe in Amdo, I think mostly, maybe in Xining or whatever, but they're completely multilingual, trilingual or whatever. But they're just fantastic as they're better than me at Western academic writing, thinking, and so on. And so this is a really extraordinary, and I didn't have any trouble to find these people. I think there's more, and there are many more. And one of them wrote to me last night saying she was at the AAS, so that's the biggest conference of the year in Asian studies in the Americas. It was last week in Vancouver, and there were 15 Tibetans scholars at AAS last week, and I don't remember how many were from Tibet. Maybe she didn't say, but there were 15 Tibetans, and they all met together with Tsering Shakya, of course, who's in Vancouver, who's the kind of superstar of this field, and quite rightly, and it was apparently very exciting. So this is unprecedented. This is really moving the whole field of Tibetan culture, who are the intellectuals, the people who are multilingual. Many of them will be from Tibet. So the ones that we train at Columbia will also know Chinese. A lot of them in other universities will learn Chinese as well. So they'll be able to manage both systems, both cultures, both resources. So this is a huge development. There are people, of course, who are in Tibetan studies who are not really academics, just maybe a general interest or they're politically interested but not academically. But that's a small number. I think most of them who are doing it, especially the ones that go on to PhDs, are really serious, and we can't match those people. They know far more than us, kind of old, European white people or whatever. We can learn from them. So I think it's very, very exciting. Now they have to just explain a couple of things. So the way we designed modern Tibetan studies at Columbia was you need to learn Chinese too. Let's be realistic, And the second thing we need to do, we say is, look, all Tibetan studies till now has really been South Asia. It's in South Asian Studies Department, and you learn Sanskrit and you focus on religion. That's not what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on, maybe religion, but in a Chinese context. The focus on religion is great, but we're going to be looking at it now, where whatever we think of it is part of China, etc. So you're going to learn Chinese or about China as well, and you're not going to just focus on the religious side, but combine that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to do it in a way that is is you to have a discipline. It's a bit technical. I've never really understood it, but academics talk about disciplines. Only certain subjects are disciplines. They have a real trained method. You know all about this: anthropology, history, sociology, whatever. Political science. They believe they have methods. Now, whereas what I do, area studies, not so clear. We mix methods. We're not considered a discipline.
Yeah.
So now, why do we say to these people, you've got to be good at discipline? It weakens their Tibet knowledge, because it means they've got to spend a lot of their time doing classes in their discipline, whatever, anthropology or something. But it means they get a job. Because you're never, except for me and Grey Tuttle, you're never going to get a job in Tibetan studies as a Tibetan studies professor. Even Sering Shakya, his job is Asian studies, but it's much higher level than ours. You want to be equipped to get a job in academia because you can teach a course in anthropology, a course in a discipline. So we have to slightly reduce their Tibet part of the studies and their China part, and maybe Nepal part, whatever, to allow space for them to have a discipline so they can get a job. We don't want you to be too focused just on Tibet. So this is another change that's happening, and in the way we're shaping the field. I think it's going to pay off. Those people are all going to get jobs now at the moment, I think. And one of them, Tenzin Tontok, she's yesterday been announced as like Deputy Secretary of the State Department for Trade. She's a MA student from Columbia program. Incredible. Tontok Rinpoche's daughter. I mean, this is really historic. And there's Nima Binara. He's a lawyer for Google, and there's a guy, a Tibetan guy at WTO, I think. This is where we're starting to see something that didn't really happen in India very much. It's very strange. Tibetans entering into the kind of professional zone, long-term training, lawyers, engineers. It's happened as Pemba, of course, was an engineer, Dechen's father, one of the first, I think. And our uncle wrote the first novel. Things that say you can see that's now happening. Now, some of those people will lose their Tibetan, or they might be fully conversant, but not all. So we're seeing a change in the whole complexion. Those people will have expertise where their Tibet knowledge will be great, but they'll have a wider range of ways to use it and ideas about how to think it through. So I think that's exciting.
I think, hopefully, I think with more Tibetans now in the West, they will probably be more and more will be educated, because now I guess they will be more like second, third generation.
Yeah, well, the work that all of you people are doing in providing Tibetan language education for Tibetans overseas, really crucial, really important. Because when they get to university, even if they do that, it's too late, really. So that really matters. Socializing in your own language is really crucial. That's why the French experiment is quite interesting. There's so many Tibetans there in Paris because they get asylum easily. They're going to keep the language. I don't know how many are going into professions, but they probably will. The first generation won't, but the second might.
So my last question. So your current role in SOAS and King's College, what are you researching? You said you've just finished your book. Are you working on something else?
Yeah, I have two projects. One, I do a project for SOAS, which is funded by UK government, which is studying Tibetan history of 50s and 60s, 1950s, 60s, before and after 59, through newspapers. Okay. So here the theory is, there's no other source. We can't go to archives, we can't go into Tibet. If we could go to Tibet, they wouldn't let us into the archives. It's very rare, they only do that occasionally. So let's start reading their propaganda. It's open source again, but let's do it as historians. Let's read the propaganda from 1950s, and now we have more techniques for looking at open source propaganda. Let's use that. And so we've been scanning in, making digital versions of all the newspapers we've been able to find from that period. So we have about 17,000 pages of newspapers from inside Tibet and outside Tibet. So we have, Rawang and outside, and maybe we have Shechao, and although that's more a journal than a newspaper. And inside we have Tibet Daily, Qinghai Daily, several other local papers. So we've got these papers, and we can digitize them all, but it's extremely difficult to digitize them. But we're sort of managing it, and we'll put those will all be online by next month at the State Library in Berlin. So anybody should be able to use them to read those newspapers. And a lot of people will start doing history as we're doing, based on interpreting newspapers. You know, can learn a lot actually. What were the Chinese saying? Matthew Ackester's already, we had a conference on this with Tashi Sering from Dharamsala, fantastic paper about journals in Dharamsala earlier on. Matthew Ackester discovered one local newspaper in Tibetan, in Sichuan, that actually revealed a campaign that was happening in the 60s that we didn't know about before. And we knew about the campaign, it's called the Four Antis, but in public, they said this was against landlords and against capitalism or something. But he discovered in this local newspaper, they obviously didn't get the memo telling them, don't say what this is really about. Because he said it's clearly about religion. It's clearly about attacking lamas and attacking them really viciously. So he's found this kind of gap, this kind of little chink in the system, in the propaganda, that helps us to see something of what was happening there. Quite remarkable. But other people in my team are looking at these newspapers and writing papers about how you can tell how the Chinese struggled with translation into Tibetan. They had to invent like words to express communist ideas and so on. Other people are looking at education at that time in the 50s and 60s. So this is one project. And then the other project I do at the same time, as I think I said, we do open source analysis of media reports. So I have a team that I mentioned, Matthew Ackester, Ron Schwartz, and the two anonymous Tibetans. And we are publishing articles about what we find. We've published articles in different places, Foreign Policy, China File, Human Rights Watch publishes a lot of them as reports. So that's the second project. And the next project is I want to do more, I want to use AI to help us interpret these contemporary open source media reports that we'll see on WeChat.
Thank you. And I feel, I mean, I find it strange these days with so much digital cameras around that there isn't like much, but they've been very good at like blocking people sending information, and everybody's got a mobile phone, but still nothing much is coming out. I mean, like it's so few information randomly coming out during like the pandemic and stuff when the things got a bit serious, but nothing since. I mean, are they like very effective at stopping them, or
not really?
What's once sometimes like when things do get out, you're like a little bit suspicious. Why did this one get out and not so many other things? Sort of.
Well, I think it's remarkable that people inside Tibet have dared to continue sending news out to RFA, and thank God that RFA has started working again. So that's important. But incredible that people are still doing it. Amazing. And I'm very upset that some Western journalists have started printing the names of who their intermediaries are in India who receive the messages. I think that helps the Chinese and isn't necessary. But still, it's incredible that people have managed to keep doing that still. But I think there's a kind of advantage. It's not really an advantage, but one advantage of this crackdown on direct news from Tibetans inside Tibet, is that it kind of forces us to stop looking for dramatic events. You know, hard news, abuses. And the advantage, of course, we should report that anytime it happens, anytime we learn about it. And we may be missing a lot, we don't know. But one advantage is it forces us to look at much more detailed things and much smaller things, things that they show in small ways, but they may be much bigger. So one of your relatives might get arrested that's terrible, but it might be just your relative, might be just 2 or 3 people. But if a policy gets through, like the language policies or the ethnic unity policy, this affects everyone. It's huge. So it's quite a good sign that we and the media are being forced to look at these larger things that affect everybody and affect the future, even though it might take us months or years to find the evidence for them by going through these propaganda reports. So that's, I mean, it's a sad thing to say, but maybe we should say, well, that's better. It's forcing us to work harder, and because working harder, we will find things which are less emotional, less dramatic, but they're probably even more serious in their impact and significance.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that's a kind of good note to finish on, like to try and look for things and things which will, like, you know, on a broader sense, help us understand much more, and, you know, which might lead to more serious things. And hopefully it'll be something for the better. I mean, we always try to be optimistic in sense, even when the world is a bit strange at the moment.
Yeah.
And so I think I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And all your kind of hard work on and taking the time to, like, you know, share all your knowledge with us in this short time. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very, very much.
I'd like to offer you the customary Tibetan kata. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And chale sama Thank you very much. Thank you very much.